recording. So that's going to be going on, and I'm just going to give it about 30 more seconds to make sure that I don't have anybody else who wants to attend that is present. We can go ahead, and if anybody else joins, I will get them pulled into the session as well. There we go. Speaking of getting somebody else joined, there we have somebody. Good timing. We're just going to get started. So when we are dealing with the NFPA 1710 and 1720 reports, we are almost always going to be running those reports out of the incident list window. So the incident module is where we're going to be starting that breakdown. And there's a variety of different things that we're going to be looking at in terms of that incident window when we are going ahead and getting started on that reporting structure. So the first thing that we want to think about when we're dealing with the NFPA 1710 and 1720 reports, let's just go for a longer time period here, is that there's several different pieces of information that these reports are calculating to determine whether the department is, successfully meeting the benchmarks involved in the reports or not. So when we look at an individual incident, we can have a look at some of the what we would consider calculated information about that call in order to kind of preview or understand where this information is coming from. So when we look at something like a general incident report, one of the first things we're going to be looking at is personnel at scene, because broadly speaking, these reports are always going to be looking at how many personnel were on scene and how fast did those people arrive. And there's a variety of ways to modify the report for that. But we can see personnel on scene is going to be an important factor. When we look at the times tab, looking at things like the dispatch time, the shoot time, and the response time is also going to be quite important. Let's just get a few more people in here. This is also going to be quite important because this is the kind of information that's going to be factored in to the report. Now, when we're looking at these calculated times on an incident, not all of you might be seeing these calculated time fields with the same labeling or the same range of fields. And because these times are so important for the NFPA reports, I want to talk to you about how these times, these intervals are calculated and where you can go to modify them. So the first time stamp here, which is in this database is labeled dispatch time, is calculated based on the incident begin time and the time that you're dispatched out by the dispatch center. So, in this case, we can see that there's a 16-second interval in here. The next timestamp shoot time is calculated based on the difference between the dispatch time and the en route time. So it's the amount of time that it took the department to respond after that you received the alarm. The next time interval is our en route time. Sometimes this is labeled travel time. And this is the difference between the en route time and the arrive on scene time. So how long it took the department to get to the scene after the truck was rolled. And the next time here is a standard time, which pretty much all departments are going to see, which is the incident response time. And that's going to be the difference between the alarm time, or the time that you were dispatched out, and the time that the department arrived on scene. Because of the way that the NFPA reports work and the statistical reporting works in general, incidents that do not have things like arrive on scene time, usually because the call was canceled or the department's was not required, those are not normally incidents that we want to include in any of our NFPA 1710 or 1720 calculations. It does not giving us any valuable information there. So we'll talk about review this and make sure that those times are correct. So there's also what we would call total time. This is not as important for that report. And this particular department has a 4 and 10 person arrival benchmark set. So all of these calculated times are configured in the setup menu under the option called custom settings. And this is done in the incidents tab under time fields. So there's a couple places, but time fields is the primary one. So these times are turned on in the response time field labels on the right-hand side. This is going to allow you to label any of these intervals. If in your department some of these are blank, you can just give them a label, and that will then start to appear. So that's often a place that we're going to want to start to make sure that you have these various response time fields. Now, the software, in terms of running the NFPA 1710 and 1720 reports, it can do that even if these response time fields are not filled out. But if you do have the response time fields visible, it gives you better transparency into the information that's being used to generate that report. So it's normally something that I would recommend. One thing that's important also to remember is that the response time fields are normally calculated when the incident is created or saved. So if you're adding these fields and they're not already labeled in the system, what you do have to do to get those fully activated is go into the incidents module, search for whatever time period of incidents you want to add those times to, and then use in the red toolbox the option called Update Calculated Times. So this will go through all those incidents in your current search and recalculate the time intervals. This is especially important if you've labeled one and have added it, and you then want to see those calculated times. So if you run into any difficulties with that process, just let us know and we can walk you through it. But this is going to give you a fair bit of supplementary information that you're going to want to use to calculate this information. So once I have stuff like that, what I'm going to do here is just save my search or hide my search parameters so I can work with the list more directly. This particular report is found in the reports button on the right-hand side, and we can see it's called NFPA 1710. We're going to be looking at several other supplementary reports in addition to this report. Realistically, when I really look at this should actually be called NFPA 1720, but it is totally possible to use this report to calculate 1710 information as well. And we'll walk through that entire process. So when I open this report, I get a variety of thresholds that I can set. And these thresholds are going to be used to determine what percentage of the selected calls the department has met those thresholds on. We're gonna go through that in a little more detail, but that's the kind of baseline, and we'll talk about how to review that sort of information before you get in there. So one of the first things that I think it's important to talk about with this type of report is that this report is really not designed for you to just run it on an entire time period without any other considerations, because it is an averages report. If, for example, you are, say, canceled en route, or it's an alarm no fire or something like that, if you didn't respond to the call, then the report will statistically say, well, that was an unsuccessful response. So normally what I'm doing at the first stages of running a report like this is I'm going through my response types specifically and thinking about what of these response types actually should qualify for this report. And in many cases related to the NFPA reports, those are going to be limited to things like fires and motor vehicle accidents. You probably, in many cases, you're not going to be wanting to do any of the other response types. So in that context, what I'm going to do is in my search parameters for incidents, I can go into the response type section, and there's a variety of functions that I can use to filter by specific response types. So, for example, I can say, I want to have a set of chosen response types, and this build list button will then appear. This is a function that allows me to pick exactly what response types I want to factor into my search. So in this case, I'll hit build list, and then I can start to select some specific response types that I want to factor in to this particular structure. And we can see in many cases, no alarm fires, grass fires, possibly wildland urban interface fire you might want to include on there. And I may determine that most of the rest of these are not ones that I want to factor in to this particular report. So once I close that window, I can hit the magnifying glass, and that is going to then filter down from the 600 odd incidents I had before down to about 188 calls that I might potentially be dealing with here. Now, further to that, I want to kind of review these calls with some thought towards exactly which ones might actually work correctly in this incident. So once again, I'm going to hide this search parameters option, and then I'm going to use the incident information columns by right-clicking on the column headers, and I can start to look at some additional information on here. And that's often going to be things like response time, for example. I might also add, say, dispatch time. And again, I can adjust these, and I might also want to have additional information like personnel on scene. So right away, looking at this information, I can see that we are going to have some of these calls, which probably I don't want to factor in here. If the response time is blank, that normally means that the department did not, in fact, arrive on scene. So if we look at this as an example, we can see that in our remarks, the incident has been documented as stood down en route. So this brings us into an important factor that we want to consider when we're doing incident entry in general, right? And this is one of those decisions that flows out into other places and other structures. Now, a good example of this would be also, so the first issue here that I need to be aware of is that I'm looking at an assistance report for this call. So, and I didn't think of that when I was putting in my search parameters, but one of the things that I'm going to want to do here is I should actually go back to my response search parameters, and on the details tab, I would say don't include assistance reports. I do have the option when I actually run the Nfpa report, it's going to factor in personnel from assistance reports automatically, but not including the assistance report is going to, first of all, filter out calls where additional stations might have been canceled, and second, it'll just simplify the process. But if we look at a call like this one, where again, we're not dealing with a response time, I would generally consider whether, well, the first thing I would consider on an incident like this is whether the response type of fire other is appropriate for this incident at all. Normally, if I'm reviewing an incident and I don't have an arrive on scene time for whatever reason, then flagging it as a fire in the system is not appropriate from a reporting standpoint. For example, that would normally be something where I would be saying this is a false alarm of some kind or some other type of incident. This is going to give me more flexibility as far as making it easier for me to filter out calls that should not be included in some of these statistical reports. Likewise, if I look at an incident like this one, where I have a response time of 31 minutes, sometimes when we're dealing with very large geographical areas, that's just going to be a factor, and you know, the response time is what it is. But it's always worth looking at some of these incidents that have potentially very long response times and determining, are these incidents entered correctly? Like, is this accurate information? And then also considering, for this class of incident, do I want to have it in my statistical breakdown? Because there's, you know, many incidents which don't really exactly fall into standard categories, so we want to be thinking about that as well. Likewise, we want to be looking at our personnel on scene information, and again identifying, okay, if we had 0 personnel on scene, then I would not normally be recording this as a wildland urban interface fire. I would normally be recording it as a something like a canceled en route or false alarm, and you know, so that kind of structure is going to be something that I might want to be adjusting as I go through to make sure. And so again, if I refilter, now that incident is not included in my statistical breakdown. So it's important to consider. Sorry, is there a question there somewhere?
There's no such thing as a false alarm now. An alarm is an alarm.
Yeah, so by false alarm, I'm using a shorthand for using a response type like canceled en route. Now, because again,
but you're saying to change that and put it into a different category.
Okay, but here's the thing. When we are taking information from dispatch and populating an incident, there's 2 pieces of information about the response type that we're generally dealing with. Right? So there is, if I look under incidents, we actually have a separate piece of information on incident reports in the system that we use, and we'll say last year. So we provide there is what we call a called in as response type, and this is the our called in as response type, and this is the response type that dispatch categorized the call as. Which could be an alarm, it could be, you know, they could be paging you out for a structure fire, but that's not necessarily what the call actually is. Like, if you are paged out for a structure fire and you are en route to the call and you are canceled en route for a variety of reasons, which does certainly happen, then putting this into your reporting system as a structure fire is not accurate. It isn't a structure fire. You were paged out for a structure fire, but you know, certainly there's a variety of reasons why in this case they would be categorizing it as an alarm, no fire, for example. And that's why if we look at,
but is it not the response type what you're getting paged out at?
No. The called in as response type is what you are getting paged out as. The response type,
exactly.
But the response type is what the call was. Is that distinction?
It's not. It isn't clear to me, and I guess this is the same argument I've had with our station. Is that whatever dispatching you out as is what the response type is. Once you've gotten there, yes, the whole situation can change, or the whole thing can change. But that it leads into your notes, not what you were paged out as. And I guess that's what I've been using. The response type is whatever the dispatch is paging it out as.
Based on the last 15 years of work that I've been doing, that's not consistent with what I'm mostly seeing across the country.
Okay, so I've been doing it wrong. Good enough.
I mean, if you're aware of that difference, so like, for example, there is, if we're dealing with, because another factor that we have to pay attention to here is that different provinces are going to have different response type standards on things. For example, in this case, we are looking at an Alberta Fire Department, which has, I would say, a lot more flexibility in terms of the response types that they have. But if we look at an Ontario response type set, we can see that in that response type set, and I'll just grab somebody kind of at random, that in that standard response type set for the province, they have specific response types for canceled en route calls, assistance not required by fire department or by other agency response types. They have mutual aid response types. So, like, from that perspective, the for just a great example, call canceled en route. You would never be paged out. You never receive the initial alarm as a call canceled en route call. You would receive it as something else, whatever dispatch is determining on there. But they might cancel you out. So we do, like I said, we do have a separate called in as response type, which is used to document what the department was called out for. But response type, in my understanding, pretty much across the board from a statistical reporting perspective, needs to be what this actually was. Because when you're running reports like an NFPA 1710, 1720, or a statistical breakdown of the call types you've had, you want to be showing what the department actually did as opposed to what the department was paged out for. So it is, and it is possible.
So I guess I'm misunderstanding on how that actually works, because the response type, if I'm told that I'm going out for a car accident and I take my vehicle that's geared for car accidents and I come onto a structure fire, to me that the response type was MVA, and that in my notes, I'm going to have that was not an MVA. The MVA happened under a carport and caused a building to start. So we had a structure fire, which means that I had to call out more vehicles or more personnel in order to deal with that situation.
Yes, but in that scenario, you would be that would require that you fill out structure fire response information for the province, that you deal with this incident as a structure fire. So, you know, certainly being paged out for a motor vehicle accident and then having it be a structure fire, for example, is a thing that happened. But from a statistical reporting perspective, that was a structure fire, not a vehicle fire.
Okay, I'll half agree with you, but again, that's the problem is if you're going to report it and there's a problem to say, like, why did you send truck number 5 that's a motor vehicle to a structure fire? Well, we were paged to go to a motor vehicle fire, so we responded correctly. That was our response type. And then during that situation, we had to increase our awareness. We increased our manpower, increased our vehicles in order to deal with the new situation. That becomes part of that one call.
Yes, and that's normally why the called in as response type is used to differentiate between what we were paged out for and what it actually was, right? That's that information modifier. If you don't have that set up in your system, then I can help you turn it on.
Okay, because that's exactly in ours. We don't have called to or called as.
Right. Okay. So that can be
a new aspect or something that I can correct now.
It's something you can correct now. Yeah. So if you go to setup under custom settings, you can go to the incidents tab and there's a checkbox called Show Called In as Response Type in the Incident General tab right here. Now, if you have an integration with dispatch, that Show Called In as Response Type will automatically be populated with the response type that dispatch selected for the call, like pre-populated for you. Otherwise, that's something that you have to select yourself. So again, I can help you out when we're not on a group call on how to configure that, but that's the basic one that you want to deal with. Now, I did have another question in chat about, can we set up other response types within your department? The answer to that is, it depends on where you are. If you are in Ontario, I believe, or New Brunswick, I think Nova Scotia as well, you have provincially mandated response types that you have to use. You can add additional response types to the list, but those would not be considered valid from a provincial reporting standpoint, and as a result would never be reported to the province. If you are in BC, Alberta, most of the other provinces, then you can set up additional response types with some caveats. So it's normally worth having a discussion with us about it, how it works in the context of your province. But in any event, the goal that we want to be looking at, and let's just make sure, is that when we're dealing with response type,
No, thank you. That does help a lot. We will just
perfect. Yeah, sometimes
discuss this on the offer.
Yeah, sometimes it's just a matter of making sure we have the right information displayed on that stuff. But the goal is for response type to show us what the call actually was, so that we have tools available like filters to say, I want to only include some specific response types in here. You know, from that perspective, sometimes departments will start just from a structural fire standpoint, because again, those are often the primaries that they're dealing with when we're looking at 1710 and 1720. But you can expand that range if you want to by selecting additional response types. Now, it's also something to consider that in some departments or some areas, especially with fire pro type departments, because we tend to be on the smaller side, is that you might be dealing with some suburban areas and some rural areas, for example, or a combination of different areas, or you're primarily interested in this report in the context of specific is not a word, specific geographical areas that you're working on. So there is a tool in the system, and we can go into this tool in a bit more detail in terms of some specific department applications, but we have in our properties module, we'll just go with all properties here. We have a tool in the properties module, which is called geographic area. So geographic area allows you to take property records and combine them into reporting units, which might not necessarily line up directly with town names, for example. And in many cases, if departments are doing, say, responses where they're contracted into a neighboring area, or they're dealing with, say, a First Nations area, or they have some large subdivisions within their fire protection area that they want to keep careful track of. Setting up geographic areas can be a really handy tool because it will allow you to basically take any incident which is assigned to this property and automatically assign it to a reporting area that you can run reports on and filter for. So what this does is that when I am looking at incidents, if I look at incidents over any particular time period, I can actually look at the assigned geo area for those incidents and see what it's been categorized as. And this categorization is set automatically based on the property record that the incident is attached to. It's not something you have to do on each individual incident. So this allows me to have another search filter that I can very quickly use to take my large incident list and break it down into specific areas that I might want to run a report like a 1710 or a 1720 on when I'm trying to see what is my response characteristics or my response times on. So if I do something like that, I could say, okay, I am looking specifically for structure fires. And locationally, I am interested in structure fires within a specific geographic area. Let's try to find one that's actually being used. Okay. So this is going to give me the 40 calls, which fall into these are structure fires that happened in the county. And I could then start to pull, using the column function, a little bit more information like personnel at scene and response time to give me a bit more context on whether these calls are probably going to be appropriate for that. Now, in this scenario, we're dealing with primarily a remote or a rural area. So we'd be factoring that in when we configure the report that we're going to run. So in this case, I can go in, hit the printer button, and select the Nfpa 1710, and that is going to give me my my report parameters. So broadly speaking, in this case, if I'm using my sort of standard 1710 structure, I would be saying, all right, I want to be looking at, I mean, I could do 80-second turnout, for example. Now, again, in the context of a primarily rural operating fire department, or when I'm dealing with rural calls, I would in fact be using something more along the lines of the NFPA 1720 rural area structure. And I would be, in that scenario, turnout threshold is not a particularly critical parameter to use. So I'd be doing something like, well, my response time target for really is 14 minutes. So let's do about, essentially say turnout threshold doesn't matter. We'll put in a number that's so large that it isn't factored in. But I can say that my on-scene threshold in this particular context would be, say, 14 minutes, for example. And I'm going to require a minimum staff in this context of 6 people on scene. So basically what I'm saying is don't pay any attention to turnout threshold, but I want 14 people on scene with 6 people on scene within 14 minutes. So when I run this report, the system's going to go through all 40 of these calls and determine whether each call hit the target threshold or not. And I know off the top of my head that this is probably not going to be highly successful because I'm looking at my response time stats already. But gives you an idea of the context of where this information is coming from. And so the report itself, in this context, is going to give me two different classes of report. Did I hit this result or did I not hit the result? And obviously, in many of these cases, we know off the bat if our personnel on scene is too low, for example, or our response time is very high, probably because, again, this is a very rural area. We're going to see, did I hit the requirements or not? And how long was the response time? When I look at something like this, where my per number of personnel on scene is 0, this is often why I want to factor, say, assist reports out, or any report, any incident where I may not have gotten personnel on scene at all. So yeah, not as successful as I would have liked to see. It does give me things like average personnel on scene, and average response time on them. But by modifying this, or saying, looking at a different set of calls, I might be able to get better results on. Likewise, I should, as a general rule, not include assistance reports in any way. So that already is giving me, obviously, in this case now we're down to 10 responses that happened in this geo area, but we can see that our structures on things like response time and personnel on scene look quite different. So if we looked at this as, for example, a suburban area, we could rerun this report using something more along the lines of, say, 10 personnel on scene in 10 minutes and just see what we're looking at in terms of that kind of response. The important thing that we want to also remember is that you have to be cognizant of the structure of your response area, where, in fact, this might not even be considered a rural area from a perspective of an NFPA 1720. We might be dealing with a remote area where my travel distance is more than 10 kilometers or so. And that structure, again, tends to modify things quite a bit. So those are the sort of things that we need to factor in when we are looking at it. Again, this was a very close one, 10 minutes and 10 seconds, 10 personnel. But as long as when you're thinking about what are we dealing with here in terms of the calls themselves, the physical area that we're working in, and how do those classify, the report's going to allow me to tweak it so that I can get a little more relevant information. Now, there are a number of reports which are also quite handy for looking at what the general NFPA 1710 benchmarks deal with, where I can do things like, say, run in what we would call an incident averages report. An incident averages report is going to give me my average benchmarking for calls, where I can go in and say, let me see what my averages are. And I can see right off the bat, I have average dispatch times, average shoot times. So, right away, with an average dispatch time of 8 minutes and 51 seconds, we're not likely to be hitting any of our NFPA 1710 benchmarks. And in fact, this is the kind of thing that I would then be going in and saying, all right, let's take a look at our dispatch times on here and filtering by, so this is a couple of great examples on the sort of thing that we start to look at when we look at an incident averages report, because these reports in particular suffer from the fundamental issue of record management software in general, which is garbage in, garbage out. So in this case, we can see we've got a 24-hour dispatch time. And this is because the dispatch time has been flagged as approximately a minute before the incident started, which means the software, it's a computer. So it's like, well, that means that they waited 23.9 hours to dispatch. So 1411, for example, would give us a substantially more accurate dispatch time on there, which would then flow back into our breakdown, and we start to see ideally much more accurate information. So that kind of review where I'm looking at my incidents to be like, I'm seeing statistical information that seems wrong. Let's check our time intervals to make sure that those look right. So that's going to give me more capability. Now, if I wanted to do an NFPA, a true sort of NFPA 1710 benchmark on that, I would be doing, say, a standard 80-second turnout with an on-scene threshold of, say, let's just do 10 and 10 there. Well, let's do 8, 10 and 8, something like that. where now I'm starting to check my turnout benchmarks, and we're factoring turnout into that structure as well. Again, has to crunch a little bit of statistical information here. Okay. So, this particular body of reports is one that we want to be paying quite a bit of attention to the actual data that is entered in our system. Often this is going to, just the process of doing this is going to give you a lot more information about how your information is being entered, how your response types are calculating, or your response times are calculating out. These are things that we want to be considering fairly carefully in the context of running a report that shows what percentage of the time you hit response benchmarks. Really critical to make sure, first of all, that the information is entered correctly, and then further down the line, are we getting the right times as part of our call transfer information. There are also several supplemental reports which also give you more useful information in that context. So when we are looking at, say, an incident averages report, we looked at that. There's also a report here which is called apparatus response time comparison. So when we're talking about a 1710 report, that tends to talk more about the time for the first engine that was due on scene, the time for the second engine that was due on scene. So this apparatus response time comparison report will actually break out those calls. This report also has the advantage of giving you the ability to pick which apparatuses you want to factor in. Because when we're dealing with responses, frequently we might get a command vehicle responding or a rescue vehicle responding, like in Jeff's example, where a rescue vehicle responded to the call, but it was a structure fire, so it should have been an engine. We can say we're only interested for this particular report in our engines, or maybe our rapid response. So I can actually hold down the control key here and pick which apparatuses I want to factor in to this report or include. And it won't really matter exactly what apparatuses are attached to these incidents. As long as it's one of these, they'll be the ones that are factored in. So what this report is going to do, well, I probably should have picked some specific apparatuses that were actually on those calls, but we'll just do everything so we can see it. So what this is going to do is it's going to break out all the incidents that I selected. It's going to show me what the response type was for the first apparatus on scene, and what the response time was for the second apparatus, and then, if applicable, the third apparatus. And it will also show me how long the time was between the first and second, or the first and third apparatuses arriving on scene. It will only select the apparatuses you pick in the report generation for the first, second, and third apparatuses based on the on-scene time for the apparatuses. So this report gives you a little bit more transparency into how long it's taking for the first selected apparatus to arrive, the second and the third apparatuses. This report is also nice because it does have a if I select everything here, it also does have an Excel output option. So rather than print that directly, you can send that right to a spreadsheet where you can use to investigate a little bit more, or cross-check different things. This would also give you the ability, if you wanted to do a comparison report, or target a report specifically for EMS units, if you're a department that's got EMS units responding from the hall. So I could, search for a different set of response types, medical response types. And then when I run a report like this, I could say, I'm only interested in my medical units, and because I'm using different fundamental benchmarks for that kind of stuff. So another supplemental report, which some departments find quite useful, is the one which is called the Incident and Vehicle Times Report. Now, I like to use the summary only output here. The report contains a lot of detailed data if you want to look at it. The summary gives me more of a big picture look. And the summary report is actually going to give me a breakdown. This is a breakdown more by apparatus than by specific incident, but it does give me some averages where I can see things like my average dispatch times, my average shoot times, but it's going to show me for each individual apparatus how many responses that apparatus did, how many times it was actually on scene, what its average dispatch time was for its calls, and things like average shoot time and average response times in there. So it gives, this particular report gives me a bit more of a per apparatus breakdown, and this can be quite useful if I'm looking specifically at my primary response apparatuses to start to get a better look at what kind of targets I'm seeing. You can then also, if you'd like to do that, use the details search parameter section where I can look for calls where a specific apparatus was dispatched. So I can say, you know, of that set, show me calls where my primary engine was dispatched or went out of the scene, and then I can run statistical report windows based on that information as well. So there's a lot of different factors that we want to consider when we're running a report like this, but broadly speaking, the critical ones are often going to be response types, making sure that you are looking at accurate response types, your personnel on scene, and your response time numbers, because those are going to be the primary factors when you're running this report to see whether a particular incident is going to meet those benchmarks or not. And being aware of where that's coming from also makes it easier for you from an administration and management perspective to be reviewing incidents and saying, okay, well, you know, I'm not seeing a response time, or our total on-scene personnel is 0. Probably ultimately we don't necessarily want to qualify this call or use it in my 1710 statistical reporting, because these 1710 and 1720 deals with calls that the department actually ended up responding to and being on scene for, generally speaking. So those sort of things are things that you want to factor in. And normally I'm going to be, when we're starting this process, I'm going to be, and let's just clear my search parameters here. I'm going to be starting with specific date periods. And then often I will also be using my location function to filter down to an individual station, where I'm saying, okay, we're working with this particular station now, and I want to use a set of specific response types. Let's say just structure fires, for example, and I would want to say don't include assistance reports, and this I would use a search structure like this as my starting point. If I want to do this regularly, annually, or I need to repeat this process for every station, usually the easiest thing to do at this point, when you've got all the basic search parameters that you want to pay attention to in, is I will save a new search on here, and we will call it Nfpa response report. So once I save that, the nice thing about that is that I can come back in the incidents module at any time, quickly pull up that search parameter set. And then once the search parameter is loaded, I can quickly toggle between station 1, station 2, and get a separate breakdown percentage call for each individual station. I could then also add things like geographic area filters to it if I wanted to do that. But again, normally I'm going to be going in and also putting things in like response time parameter, the dispatch time parameter and the personnel on scene. If you want to keep those on here all the time, you just right click on the blue and select save as my list template. If you want to have a special version of this where you've sort of reorganized everything and this is what you want to see, you can use the green plus button next to the list template and say NFP review as a separate list template. If you do set up a template like this, make sure you toggle it with this little eyeball button from a private template to a public one. That means that everybody in FirePro in your department can use this template. And then you have it available when you're going in. That would allow you to say quickly, give me my response report and toggle it so I see my NFPA review template, which has all the columns that I wanted to see on it. This lets me then start by going, okay, what are my dispatch times? Those all look pretty solid. Might add response time in here. Come on, Jeremy. Response time's already on there. I got response time. So I'm going to be able to see that kind of information before I go in and start to run the statistical reports. Now, in all this context, we're happy to have a discussion with you. We can review your data, have a talk about how we want to break up different geographic areas. But the main takeaway that you want to have with using the NFPA 1710 and 1720 reports is that these very much, it's important to establish context and take your larger set of incidents and search it down to a more manageable, accurate set so that when the system spits out what percentage of the time you were successful on those benchmarks, it is actually an accurate percentage of calls. So we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to throw the floor open to questions. If people have any, you can drop it in the chat or go off mute and ask if you have anything. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to go ahead and stop recording.